Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to our final session of the day, for which we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. And I'd like to invite all of them now to join me on the stage to discuss defense and security in the Eastern Mediterranean region. First of all, please welcome the Minister of National Defense of Greece, Nikos Dendias. Welcome, Minister. It's great to have you with us for this final session. Florence Parly, former Minister of the Armed Forces of France. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, former Minister of Defense of Germany. And Hryhoriy Nemyria, First Deputy Chairman, Foreign Affairs Committee, Parliament of Ukraine, former Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. So the Minister, if you would join us here. Welcome. Thank you. It's great to see so many people in the room, and obviously I wouldn't expect anything less for the Minister and our guests for this very important session. And we're going to follow the same format. First of all, we're going to hear from the Minister and then the other panelists, and we'll open up for a discussion. So, Minister, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'll address the audience in Greek, if you will allow me, since we are in Greece. Κυρίες και κύριοι, αξιότιμοι καλεσμένοι, είναι πολύ μεγάλη χαρά και τιμή για μένα να συμμετάσχω στο 27ο ετήσιο συνέδριο του Economist με τον πάρα πολύ επίκαιρο τίτλο «Άμυνα και ασφάλεια στην Ανατολική Μεσόγειο». Ακριβώς τη στιγμή που η διεθνής κοινότητα προσπαθεί να αντιμετωπίσει το ενδεχόμενο μιας νέας σύγκρουσης. Έχουμε δύο πολεμικές συγκρούσεις δυστυχώς στην ευρύτερη περιοχή μας και αν προσθέσουμε τον Αγκόρνο Καραμπάχ και την Ιεμένη, 4. Επίσης, έναν εμφύλιο πόλεμο στο Σουδάν και μια πλήρη αποσταθεροποίηση στην ευρύτερη περιοχή του Σαχέλ. Και σαν τραγική ηρωνία, σήμερα γιορτάζουμε την ίδρυση του Οργανισμού Ηνωμένων Εθνών. Μια στιγμή που απέχουμε ίσως όσο ποτέ από την υλοποίηση των αρχών και των αξιών που ο χάρτης των Ηνωμένων Εθνών εκφράζει. Για μας, για την ελληνική δημοκρατία, η προάσπιση των αρχών αυτών βρίσκεται πάντοτε στον πυρήνα της πολιτικής μας. Άλλωστε αυτό καταδεικνύουν και οι 3 υποψηφιότητες της πατρίδας μας, της Ελλάδας, για πρώτη φορά στην ιστορία μας, για τη θέση του μη μόνιμου μέλους του Συμβουλίου Ασφαλείας, για την Προεδρία της Γενικής Συνέλευσης και επίσης ως μέλος του Συμβουλίου Ανθρωπίνων Δικαιωμάτων. Κυρίες και κύριοι, η Ελλάδα ευθέως και από την πρώτη στιγμή καταδίκασε τις τρομοκρατικές επιθέσεις της Χαμάς. Πράξεις τυφλής βίας που κόστησαν πέραν των άλλων στη ζωή σε πάρα πολλούς αμάχους και που κατά την κρίση μας αποδυναμώνουν τις θεμιτές προσδοκίες του Παλαιστινιακού λαού. Για την προστασία ακριβώς των αμάχων μίλησε χθες, μεταξύ άλλων, και ο Πρωθυπουργός της Ελλάδας, ευρισκόμενος στο Ισραήλ. Στην Ανατολική Μεσόγειο, η Ελλάδα, μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης και του ΝΑΤΟ, επιδιώκει την εμπέδωση της σταθερότητας, της ασφάλειας και την διαμόρφωση συνθηκών οικονομικής ανάπτυξης. Εμείς, οι Έλληνες, αντιλαμβανόμαστε πάντοτε τη Μεσόγειο ως γέφυρα, όχι ως φυσικό εμπόδιο. Ως γέφυρα που ενώνει λαούς, κουλτούρες, πολιτισμούς. Άλλωστε, ο σταθεροποιητικός ρόλος της πατρίδας μας αποδεικνύεται από τις εκατοντάδες, πάνω από 350 συμφωνίες που έχουμε συνάψει την τελευταία τετραετία με χώρες από όλο τον κόσμο, με προεξάρχουσες τις 2 συμφωνίες αμοιβαίας αμυντικής συνεργασίας μεταξύ της Ελλάδας και των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών, την αμυντική συμφωνία με την Γαλλία, την αμυντική συμφωνία με τα Ηνωμένα Αραβικά Εμιράτα, την στρατηγική συμφωνία με τη Σαουδική Αραβία και τις δύο συμφωνίες οριοθέτησης αποκλειστικών οικονομικών ζωνών με την Ιταλία και την Αίγυπτο, με την οποία διατηρούμε και στρατηγική σχέση. Και επίσης με τα πολλαπλά πολυμερή και τριμερή σχήματα συναντιλήψεων που διατηρούμε με την Κυπριακή Δημοκρατία. Δεν σας λέω κάτι καινούριο αν σας πω ότι οι συνεργασίες μας προβλέπουν τη συμμετοχή όλων, χωρίς καμία εξαίρεση, με μία βασική προϋπόθεση, τον πλήρη σεβασμό στο διεθνές δίκαιο, το διεθνές δίκαιο της θάλασσας και τον καταστατικό χάρτη των Ηνωμένων Εθνών. Πιστεύουμε επίσης στην παρουσία στην περιοχή μας των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών και του ΝΑΤΟ. Θεωρούμε ότι μπορεί να λειτουργήσουν ως θεμέλιο σταθερότητας. Εμείς πιστεύουμε ότι το ΝΑΤΟ δεν είναι μόνο μια αμυντική συμμαχία, αλλά μια συμμαχία προάσπισης αξιών και αρχών. Και ότι η ρωσική εισβολή στην Ουκρανία ανέδειξε ακριβώς αυτό το ρόλο του ΝΑΤΟ. Και με την ευκαιρία αυτή θα ήθελα να πω ότι χαιρετίζω την απόφαση του Προέδρου Ερντογάν χθες να προωθήσει την σουηδική συμμετοχή του ΝΑΤΟ ως νομοθέτημα στην τουρκική εθνοσυνέλευση. Κυρίες και κύριοι, στην ευρύτερη περιοχή μας, όπως σας είπα και πριν, αντιμετωπίζουμε έναν γεωπολιτικό γόρδιο δεσμό. Θα μου επιτρέψετε να πω ότι αυτό έχει αιτίες. Και οι αιτίες έχουν πολύ να κάνουν με τις 5 λανθασμένες βασικές υποθέσεις που η μεγάλη πλειοψηφία κάναμε στην αρχή του 21ου αιώνα. Η πρώτη λανθασμένη προϋπόθεση είναι ότι η δημοκρατία επιτέλους έχει επικρατήσει στον πλανήτη και θα συνεχίσει να εξαπλώνεται. Αντίθετη του πραγματικού απεδείχθη, αρκεί να δει κανείς τι συμβαίνει στις χώρες του Σαχέλ. Η δεύτερη λάθος υπόθεση είναι ότι η Κίνα, όσο γίνεται πιο εύκολη και πιο ισχυρή οικονομικά, θα γινόταν πιο ανοιχτή και πιο δημοκρατική. Η τρίτη λάθος υπόθεση εργασίας ήταν ότι ανεξαρτήτως της διεύρυνσης του ΝΑΤΟ προς Ανατολάς, η Ρωσία θα γίνει μέλος της Ευρωπαϊκής Αρχιτεκτονικής Ασφάλειας, θα διασφαλίσει επίσης την σταθερότητα στο Νότιο Κάυκασο και θα παραμείνει σταθερός προμηθευτής φθηνής ενέργειας στην Ευρώπη. Η τέταρτη λάθος υπόθεση ήταν ότι μπορεί το παλαιστινιακό ζήτημα να παραγωνιστεί και να αντιμετωπιστεί σε ένα απότερο μέλλον όταν οι διαχωριστικές γραμμές Ισραήλ και αραβικού κόσμου έχουν πάψει να υπάρχουν. Και η πέμπτη λάθος υπόθεση, ίσως η πιο καταστροφική και από τις 4 άλλες μαζί, είναι ότι το μοντέλο οικονομικής ανάπτυξης που ακολουθήσαμε τον 21ο αιώνα μπορεί να συνεχιστεί και τον 21ο αιώνα χωρίς να αντιμετωπιστούν οι συνέπειες της κλιματικής αλλαγής. Οι συνέπειες λοιπόν αυτές ήδη έχουν εκδηλωθεί και τα σημάδια για το μέλλον, αν δεν αντιδράσουμε άμεσα, είναι δυσίωνα. Και όχι μόνο αυτά, ο αναθεωρητισμός μετά από δεκαετίες αναλαμβάνει με ιστορικό θράσος να αμφισβητήσει αξίες και συνθήκες πάνω στις οποίες βασίζεται η παγκόσμια αρχιτεκτονική ασφάλειας. Για τα σημάδια της περιβαλλοντικής χρήσης δεν χρειάζεται να σας πω πολλά. Λίγες εκατοντάδες χιλιόμετρα βορειότερα η Θεσσαλία έχει υποφέρει, αλλά επίσης και η Ιταλία και η Σλοβακία. Η Ελλάδα έχει αναλάβει, όπως ξέρετε, την προεδρία του Ocean Conference, μια εκδήλωση ιδιαίτερου ενδιαφέροντος για την προστασία του οικοσυστήματος της Μεσογείου και των θαλασσών. Όμως δεν είναι μόνο αυτές οι προκλήσεις. Η παράτυπη μετανάστευση από Ανατολή και Νότο προς Βορρά και Δύση έχει ενταθεί. Οι δημοκρατικές κυβερνήσεις, όπως η κυβέρνηση του Νίγηρα, υπό τον πρόεδρο Μπαζούμ, ανατρέπονται. Σε αυτό το γεωπολιτικό περιβάλλον, η ενίσχυση της συνεργασίας του ΝΑΤΟ με την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση είναι πιο αναγκαία από ποτέ. Η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, υιοθετώντας τη στρατηγική πυξίδα, προβάλλει τη θέλησή της να διαδραματίσει έναν σημαντικό γεωπολιτικό ρόλο και συνεργαζόμενη με το ΝΑΤΟ μπορεί να διασφαλίσει ασφάλεια και σταθερότητα στη Μεσόγειο, αλλά και πέραν αυτής. Όμως, οφείλω να πω ότι υπάρχουν προβλήματα. Ενώ απέναντι στην ρωσική εισβολή η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση τήρησε μια αξιέπαινα, ομόφωνη και σταθερή στάση, στην κρίση της Μέσης Ανατολής επέστρεψε στην παραδοσιακή πολυφωνική κακοφωνία και επίσης στα Δυτικά Βαλκάνια, πολλές φορές παλινδρομή. Και το ΝΑΤΟ, από την πλευρά του, περιλαμβάνει χώρες που τους διαφεύγει να επιβάλλουν κυρώσεις στην Τουρκία ή που ξεχνούν να καταδικάσουν τις φωνικές επιθέσεις της Χαμάς εναντίον αμάχων. Η τρέχουσα κατάσταση που εξελίσσεται στη Μέση Ανατολή δημιουργεί επιπλέον προβλήματα στο μοντέλο που έχουμε επιλέξει για την ανάπτυξή μας, δημιουργεί επιπλέον κινδύνους στα ζητήματα προμήθειας ενέργειας. Εμείς, η Ελλάδα, υποστηρίζουμε και υπηρετούμε την διαφοροποίηση των πηγών, των προμηθευτών και των διαδρομών ενέργειας. Οι εγκαταστάσεις αποθήκευσης ρευστοποιημένου φυσικού αερίου στην Αλεξανδρούπολη, στη Ρεβιθούσα και μελλοντικά στο Βόλο και στην Κόρινθο, η ΟΤΑΠ, η καθετοποιημένη αγωγή Ελλάδας-Βουλγαρίας και Ελλάδας-Βόρειας Μακεδονίας, ο EastMed, οι ηλεκτρικές διασυνδέσεις EuroAsia και EuroAfrica είναι έργα που υπηρετούν τη συνεισφορά της Ελλάδας σε αυτήν τη διαφοροποίηση. Μάλιστα, πριν από λίγες μέρες υπέγραψα μαζί με τους ομολόγους μου της Βουλγαρίας και της Ρουμανίας ένα letter of intent για την επέκταση του αγωγού εφοδιασμού καυσίμων του ΝΑΤΟ προς την Βουλγαρία και τη Ρουμανία, εξασφαλίζοντας τη δυνατότητά τους να έχουν εναλλακτικές πηγές ενέργειας. Κυρίες και κύριοι, υπό τις σημερινές συνθήκες αμφισβήτησης της εύθραυστης γεωπολιτικής ισορροπίας στην περιοχή μας, εμείς, η ελληνική δημοκρατία, θεωρούμε ότι παραμένουμε παράγον γεωπολιτικής και ενεργειακής σταθερότητας, στο πλαίσιο βεβαίως των δυνατοτήτων και του μεγέθους μας. Είμαστε προσιλωμένοι στην επίλυση των διαφορών με βάση τις αρχές του διεθνούς δικαίου και του δικαίου της θάλασσας. Παραμένουμε ενεργοί σε περιφερειακές πρωτοβουλίες για την ειρήνη, μακριά από ιδεολογήματα περασμένων αιώνων, από απειλές, από αντιλήψεις της εποχής των κανονιοφόρων. Αναγνωρίζουμε το πέρας της εποχής των δογμάτων και των αποστεωμένων αντιλήψεων που οδηγούν τις κοινωνίες σε αδιέξοδα. Αλλά είμαστε πάντοτε έτοιμοι να προασπίσουμε την κυριαρχία μας και τα κυριαρχικά μας δικαιώματα, όπως αυτά προκύπτουν από το διεθνές δίκαιο και το διεθνές δίκαιο της θάλασσας. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm going to hand straight over to Florence Parly. Welcome to our conference. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here today in Athens with so many Greek friends in the room. When Economist Impact set the program on this three-day conference and designed a panel around defense and security in the Eastern Med region, nobody would have bet that Hamas would have hit Israel like never before. This conference would have probably mentioned the tensions between Israel and the Palestinians' occupied territories as, if I may, business as usual, when it may turn into a war with overspilling effects in the whole region and beyond. I had been with my friend Annegret, Minister of the Armed Force, me for France, for 5 years, from 2017 to 2022. Over the last 6 years, I'm not sure that peace and stability have improved worldwide. To phrase it bluntly, very few of you would have bet that war would be back in Europe. Still it is. And very few of you would have bet that war might be back in the Eastern Med, involving Israel. Still it is. As my government came into office in 2017, we conducted a review of threats facing France, and the results was not entirely reassuring. After 2 decades of peace dividends, we were waking up to a world where the West, and therefore democracies, gradually had to share hegemony, a world where power politics were back in Russia, in China, a world where new worrying trends had emerged. Terrorism spread and would not be some Trojan fit for violence like the Red Brigades in the old days. It would be the fight of a generation, and we are back to that. New fields of conflict also were confirmed: cyber, space, seabed. And meanwhile, as a part of a more general retreat from multilateralism, international regimes, proliferation norms, arms control rules were on the wane. So this is not a pleasant mix. And this is a recipe for confrontation. On top of the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, economic interdependencies have grown very significantly, boosted by the international trade growth that has started after 1945 and globalization. Confrontation hits borders again in Europe, killing soldiers and civilians. Confrontation hits Israel and the Palestinians. Confrontation hits our economies, hits finance, technologies, and hits multilateralism as well. In this environment, the Eastern Med is and has always been a hot spot. The Med Sea is a key area between Europe, Africa, and Asia, bridging 22 countries and hosting more than 500 million inhabitants. The eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea looks like a boiling pot where old and unsolved conflicts, contested maritime areas, assertive regional powers, rearmament, strategic competitors are mixed together. Powers are back in the Med Sea, creating growing tensions with, in the eastern backstage, a fight for gas resources. The US focus on rivalry with China that has started more than 10 years ago is bolstering the confidence of countries such as Iran and Turkey, which are seeking to assert themselves as regional powers. Both seize all opportunities to advance their interests. These reconfigurations are leading to instability and strategic environment deterioration in the region. As a consequence, rearmament has never been as dynamic in the area for decades. Turkey, a NATO ally, provides armament and military support to Libya, despite the UN arms embargo. The Turkish Navy has or had, I don't know, a permanent presence off Cyprus due to political and territorial dispute related, among others, around gas drilling. Turkey has been increasing its military investment for years, building a national defense industry able to provide cheaper, still efficient equipments, such as drones, that were used in Azerbaijan or in High Karabakh. Russia has been increasing its presence in East Med since President Obama's decision not to launch a strike against chemical site in Syria in 2013. Russia has now a permanent presence with a naval base in Tartus, an air base in Latakia. However, the number of Russian ships in the East Med has significantly decreased since the beginning of Ukraine's invasion, as the Black Sea has turned into a closed sea. Iran has been providing armament and capabilities to non-state organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas for years. And we can see the result with thousands of rockets being fired against Israel. Last but not least, the United States is back in the Med Sea after years of disengagement. Since 2022, the US Navy has been back, and more recently, since the attack of Israel by Hamas, the US sent 2 airstrike carriers sailing along the Israeli coast that were able to neutralize Houthi missiles launched against Israel. Now, the Eastern Med is going to turn into an explosive area. The attack of Israel by Hamas on October 7th brings the whole region and beyond to climax. It's quite a long time that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is developing with more downs than ups. In the recent years, it was in 2021, clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians turned into full-scale fighting. The death toll was the highest since the Gaza war in 2014. The fragile ceasefire that began late May 21 broke into pieces with the unprecedented terrorist attacks that took place on the 7th of October this year. The death toll of such a massacre is by far much higher than ever. An estimated 1,400 Israelis were killed by Hamas, mostly civilians, with hundreds more taken hostage and still accounted for. Strikes on the Gaza Strip to neutralize Hamas leaders and fighters have led to thousands of Palestinian casualties. Palestinians are massively displaced to the southern part of Gaza, and a huge humanitarian disaster is in place, despite the very welcome delivery of humanitarian aid through the Egyptian border that has started last weekend on a too small scale, unfortunately. I'm no longer representing the French government and have no special intelligence insight to share or not to share. After the brave visit paid by President Biden to Israel last week, and after other European leaders' visits, President Macron just arrived in Israel today for a two-day visit to express France's solidarity with Israel. I'm truly convinced that he will make his best efforts first to get our hostages and all the hostages freed after having repatriated our fellow citizens to France. He will call certainly the parties to avoid escalation and to comply with the international humanitarian rules. And I'm sure that he will advocate for resuming a genuine peace process leading to the two-state solution with a Palestinian state next to Israel, ensuring Israel's security. This implies to end the settlement process. As a first step, President Biden succeeded in convincing Egypt to let the humanitarian aid being delivered in Gaza. The diplomatic efforts made by the United States, the Europeans, and some neighboring countries should not deter Israel to react, but hopefully deter to overreact. Looking forward, it would not be an easy process, but a peace process deserves to be initiated again. Remember our hope after Oslo's agreement when it was concluded. It was a strong hope for peace, and it is our collective responsibility to mobilize our brains and energy to make it happen. So I will conclude with two questions and one conviction. The first question is, what will be the consequences of new Israel-Hamas war? I can identify a few of them, even if it's very difficult and unforeseeable. Already visible are the recent terrorist attacks in Belgium, in France, as an indirect outcome of the Israel-Hamas conflict. We knew that fighting against terrorism was not over in Europe, in the Middle East and Africa, and we remain fully committed to it. Second, Abraham's agreements will significantly probably be delayed, but probably not given up. Third, the US is back in Europe, and we are extremely grateful for the US support, strong support, delivered to Ukraine. And the US is back in the Middle East also, by necessity for sure, but is back, while its Asian focus will not be lowered. But it does not mean for us as Europeans that we could do less for our defense and security. So there is a strong need for partnership and for building a security architecture. And when Europe's security is at stake, Europeans should be around the table. I have in mind the INF Treaty, which concerns Europe's security, and that was signed by the US and the USSR a long time ago, and that was ended up by the United States and Russia in 2019. There is also a strong need for NATO-EU cooperation instead of competition. Happily, it is now fully recognized and mentioned in the Vilnius NATO Summit communiqué released in last July. More broadly, we must find ways to extend our partnerships to create alliances of countries willing to keep the international rules alive. Second question, what will the new world order look like? We know where we come from. We inherited from the rules-based order from those who fought during World War II. We don't know what the new world order will be made of, but it may look even more fragmented, with opportunistic positioning from nations sticking to their interest and partnering accordingly. In a mood of hostility, or at least distrust vis-à-vis the West, as we can see developing in the so-called Global South. As a result, the West may be more united, but more isolated from the rest of the world. That's something we must solve. And less superpowers, and probably more powers able to destabilize the others. I will end up my speech by expressing my strong conviction and that in this new and dangerous environment, Europe has a major role to play. I've always been convinced that Europe needs to be able to defend itself without depending too much on others, and that Europe is a major economic power, having the largest consumer market worldwide. I have constantly advocated for it with my European colleagues, as Annegret knows. We launched together, she launched the strategic compass during the German presidency. And as France, we made it approved early 2022. And that was one of the great achievements we made together, as well as the European Peace Facility, which was approved a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine. We, as Europeans, just got an up-and-running tool to fund and provide military equipment to Ukraine worth than more 12 billion euros. That was a remarkable achievement. However, lots of challenges must be addressed. Contrary to the United States or Russia, we doesn't have oil or gas. We doesn't have a single European military. We are moving fast, maybe not as fast, to take care of our weaknesses. We must keep in mind that we, as Europe, have our own interest, and whatever the links that united us with our ally, the United States, sometimes these interests may be a bit different from those of the United States. That's why President Macron, from the very beginning of its first mandate, called for a European sovereignty. He not only called for it, he fought for it, convincing his European colleagues to go for it. So, don't get me wrong, I'm not naive about where Europe stands from its autonomy standpoint. But it would be extremely naive to believe that our interests would be better taken into account by someone else, including our best allies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's certainly extremely valuable to have the French input into this very important discussion. European French, just as it is to hear from a representative of Germany and a former defense minister. Welcome.
So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speaker, you, Ms. Oesit, this morning we are living in a troubled world, and you are absolutely right. We face a situation where underlying strategical shifts and major developments shape our world, like the growing gap between the global south and the Western world, rising competition between China and the US, the increasing impact of climate change everywhere in the world that amplified migration to Europe, and technological revolutions like AI. And we face a world where wars like the Russian ones against Ukraine, or the terror war of Hamas against Israel, and thousands of innocent civilians in Israel have cost so many lives in the region until today, until to this very moment. One has to understand that these conflicts and challenges happen at the same time in different places on different levels. They are interwoven and they demand a kind of multitasking conflict management. So it's necessary and important to ask if we in Europe and NATO are really prepared to do this, or as you ask, if we are in the need of new Euro-Atlantic security architecture. In 2022, both the European Union and NATO adopted renewed strategic documents, EU's strategic compass and NATO's new strategic concept. The EU have called the compass an ambitious plan of action for strengthening EU security and defense policy. The compass sees EU capabilities complementary to NATO. It intensifies support for global rules-based order with UN at its core. We, the heads of state and government of NATO, have gathered in Madrid as war has returned to the European continent. These were the opening words of the Madrid Summit Declaration. The summit focused on two main objectives: agreeing further immediate measures in response to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, agreeing a new strategic concept to drive alliance adaptation and modernization over the next decade. It's comprised a fundamental shift to deterrence and defense based on three pillars: more forward deployed combat formations, more high readiness forces, more pre-positioned military equipment, stockpiles, facilities in so-called frontline nations. So I think you can say there is a groundwork with which both European Union and NATO have responded to the experiences of the last few years. The Trump administration, a pandemic exposing our weaknesses and interdependencies, but especially the Russian war against Ukraine. But this groundwork is in need for a reality check again and again, and for the ability and the willingness to adapt it smartly and to put it fast into action where and when necessary. Russia, there is no doubt, wants to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign country in order to geographically restore the old Soviet Union. In doing so, Putin's Russia is fighting against values and principles that the West, Europe, and NATO stand for. He's using a hybrid warfare of both military violence and political destabilization. Therefore, it's so important to guarantee a sustainable security for Ukraine. In my opinion, the only sustainable security for Ukraine is the membership of NATO as fast as it's possible, as well as a realistic and reliable accession perspective for the Western Balkans. The Ukrainian counteroffensive may have been slower than many hoped, but it is far from being unsuccessful. Ukraine has disabled Russian radar and ships on the western side of Crimea. It has thus weakened and pushed back the Russian Black Sea Fleet and created a free passage for ships transporting grain from Odessa. With atoms, it has a precision weapon with which it can attack all Russian staffs, logistical hubs between the front and the Sea of Azov. This has two consequences. In addition to the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea region is coming more into the focus, as well as the role of NATO member states there, as Romania, Bulgaria, and especially Turkey. Given that the Black Sea is a region of highest Russian interest, for instance, as its open door to the Eastern Mediterranean, where countries like Libya are serving as Russian bridgehead, the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean may also require even more attention from Greece as one of the most important NATO members. What Ukraine needs now to win the war are large quantities of artillery ammunition, high-range precision weapons as ATACMS or Taurus, and better electronic warfare capabilities. This is primarily a question of production capacities in Europe. The states must do more, for example, through state purchase guarantees. The murderous attacks of Hamas on civilians in Israel and the threat to expand the conflict backed by Iran also have consequences for us. Hamas, like other groups such as IS, want to destroy and erase Israel because it's a Jewish state and for the values and freedom it stands for. So they attack Israel, but also our shared values. And the loud anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Western protest all over in our cities shows that there is a relevant sounding board within our societies. But what is frightening me, it's far more what is frightening me, it's far more the support from the progressive left and especially the droning silence of so many indifferent citizens. It shows the fragility of our democratic resilience as well. And it's pouring oil in the debates about migration and integration and makes radicals and populists stronger and thus make us weaker. The last point in particular shows that what we need above all is a different way of thinking, a different attitude, more realism, more determination, and ability to act. Maybe, or probably, this is the architecture that we need to change the most and which is the hardest one to deal with, the one in our own heads. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, we have a view from Ukraine.
Kalimera. It is a great pleasure and honor for me as a Ukrainian politician with Greek roots to be here in Athens to address such an audience and speaking together with my Greek, German and French colleagues about future of Europe and the future of global security order. And this is the first comment I would like to make. War in Ukraine is not about territory. War against Ukraine is about who will write rules of a new security order. This is what's at stake. It means two things. First, if this is war not about territory, that any proposed hypothetical solution based on the principle land for peace or peace for land is not something that would bring a real, sustainable and comprehensive peace. This is very important to understand from the very beginning to avoid a disappointment in the future. The second consequences of this, that this is war about who will write rules of a new security order, that this is war not just about Ukraine or Ukraine and Russia or the immediate region or even extended region of the Greater Black Sea, or even if you add East Med here, it's war that would have broader, more comprehensive consequences, which also brings a logic, inbuilt logic, that any sustainable solution for this war would require involvement, not just Ukraine and Russia, as sometimes we hear, but the involvement of a number of big powers, Europe among them, P5 probably, and I believe that should include China also, and also would have this solution would have not just relationships to Ukraine itself and to the end of war itself, but would have an impact on a number of burning issues. Some of them been already addressed, but I would like to address one that so far no one mentioned. It's a future of strategic arms control. It's about future strategic arms control, taking into account of increasing role and appetite of China. Fact that the Ukrainian precedent was read by Iran and North Korea as a license to neglect any talks about security guarantees, based on the fact that back in Budapest in 1994, while Ukraine having third largest nuclear arsenal and joining non-proliferation treaty, received security guarantees that were empty, as we are painfully learning now. So this is our consequences of this point of departure. I believe we have to understand, internalize, and to act accordingly. Not war about territory. And it's not, my German colleague, not just about Russia's aspiration, of Putin's, to be more precise, aspiration to restore a kind of Soviet Union. It's not about this. It's about more global ambition. The ambition to be a winner, to write the rules of the new global security order. Second comment I would like to make is about the line that we are here, and we very much attentive to this line. I welcome it the first time it's appeared. Every single European leader and the US government was very consistent in saying the following line: we will be with Ukraine as long as it takes. Very good. We appreciate this expression of solidarity. Only recently, probably in a matter of 3 months, in addition to we will be with Ukraine as long as it takes, what appeared to defend Ukraine. Good, positive. But I believe it was necessary but not sufficient. What is necessary and sufficient? And that's we are so far missing. In terms of what is at stake, in terms of the price that has been paid already and is going to be paid, because we have to pay this price, the important line, the change and correction of this line should be: we will stay with Ukraine as long as it takes to win this war. And that brings us to the definition of victory. What does it mean to win this war? I would like to leave it for next comments also, the answers to this. We have to find this answer together. It's not up to the United States, it's not up to Germany, it's not up to Ukraine or France or any other country to define the victory. It should be a joint effort and a joint responsibility and a joint commitment to stick to this responsibility. I also would like to add, to bring you some flavor of this 20 months of war. When the war has started, no one knew how long it will take. After last summer successful counteroffensive, when Ukraine liberated northern part and southern part, including city of Kherson in the south, we experienced a kind of euphoria and expectations that the war will end sooner rather than later. It's not the case now. Yulia Tymoshenko was speaking about protracted war and the need to defend and to avoid this. Only one figure for you to feel how it is to be in war in Ukraine, just for the capital city. I'm living in the city of Kyiv, while my hometown is Donetsk, which is currently occupied by the Russian occupiers, Russian troops. Only for this year, Kyiv, the capital city, only Kyiv, not the whole Ukraine, was attacked by more than 300 missiles. More than 300 missiles. Most of them are cruise missiles, but a significant amount also, almost 20 missiles, are ballistic missiles, which are very difficult to protect from. So this is the everyday life of the Ukrainian cities, especially Kyiv as a capital city. Could you imagine how it to be in the cities and the villages and the towns closer to the front line? So this is the life we are living through. And I would like again to use this opportunity to end my introductory remarks to thanking all those who are present and supporting Ukraine, to thank Greece and Greek people. I would like to recognize also Minister Dendias, who contributed a lot to making Odessa being protected by UNESCO as a special town. That's so important for the Greek history. Because Filiki Eteria It's about Greece, about the independent Greek state. And how you could live with that when the center of Odessa is bombed on a regular basis, barbarically. Innocent civilians are giving their life. Orthodox cathedral was bombed in the center of Odessa. How you could live with this? So therefore, it's so important to see that every country has its part of his memory, part of his solidarity. And I believe unless we find the resolution, commitment, and courage to consider this war, not theirs war, but our war, we have to win, then unfortunately next year the situation will be more gloomy. But I'm optimist and would like again to call for this solidarity in action. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. Now, we have to finish at 5:45. We have a cocktail reception hosted by the Prime Minister of Kosovo, to which everybody is invited. So maybe I can ask each of you one question, and we'll have to keep the answers quite brief. Starting with you, Minister, and you were very brief. Disciplined in your remarks, but yet your talk was very wide-ranging, actually, and I hope we can address some of the topics you raised. You really emphasized in a proactive way the role that Greece can play in addressing and helping to resolve some of the problems on Europe's doorstep. But I wanted to ask you from a Greek defense and security perspective, what are the main risks from the Israel-Hamas war? Is it that it could derail this rapprochement that began between Greece and Turkey? Is it that it could lead to other spillovers, such as an intensification of the migrant crisis? What are the ramifications of this for Greece directly?
Well, thank you for that. There's not an easy answer, and I have to say that really the Pandora's box can open, and it will be extremely difficult to address what comes out of it. Just thinking loudly, what we're seeing here is a huge, huge problem that can destroy what has been achieved with the Abraham Accords, which means a rapprochement between Israel and a substantial part of the Arab world, with which Greece has a very cordial, close relation. Apart from that, Egypt is a strategic partner of Greece, but a country whose stability, and please allow me to say prosperity, is not just essential, but is existential for the Eastern Mediterranean and for Europe. And it is clear that a huge conflict in the Middle East could really pull Egypt within it, especially if it comes from Gaza and has to address the Palestinian issue. Also, radical Muslim elements in the coast of the Mediterranean. It's a huge alarm to us. It's a huge also alarm to the Republic of Cyprus, for which it's not a secret to anybody, Greece cares dearly. And of course, the position of Turkey towards this crisis in the Middle East is not the position that Greece would have hoped for. It's not for me to criticize Turkey, and it's not for me to dictate the position of the Turkish government, but we would have hoped for a clear condemnation of terrorism against the citizens of Israel. And there's the very long list would include also problems that may arise from radical Muslim elements in the Western Balkans. So we could have a spillover of the crisis all around. Libya is not stable, is a failed state. And again, the Sahel, as everybody knows in the room, is falling apart. regardless of the valiant French effort to stabilize it. We were talking to President Bazoum of the Niger, a leader with whom one could talk straightly about the future of the region. He's not there anymore. So the list is endless. And really addressing it is a huge problem. The only thing that we should do, and allow me to underline that again and again, is to have a very clear understanding between the European Union and NATO and the United States, and speak with a common language. That's the only thing we can now offer towards this total instability in our region. And that is what Greece is hoping for.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. And at the end, perhaps you can come back when you hear the answers to the other questions to sum up. So turning now to you, Ms. Parly, I know you're not a representative of the official representative of France, but nevertheless, we do want to hear from a French person about a French perspective. And you touched on some of this in at the close of your remarks. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has changed the conversation in Europe about strategic autonomy, being a geopolitical actor, European sovereignty, and so on. I think everybody has acknowledged already that Europe remains overly dependent on the US as the decisive player. So how should the EU proceed? Is the aim simply to strengthen the European pillar of NATO and to, as Annegret advocated, build up Europe's defense capacities, in particular in this urgent situation of Ukraine? What are the steps that you think are most important?
Well, I think, of course, that a lot has been done in a very short period of time when Russia started invading Ukraine. Sometimes Europeans are slow, but they were quick to react, and probably this was unexpected, at least by Vladimir Putin himself. So I think that we have a lot to be done, and stating that a stronger European defense makes a stronger NATO is a very nice and very true motto, but we have to work it out. And there are not small details in this topic. There are only major questions. The first one is that we do not have common standards. We do not have a common, or at least a cooperative defense industry. And I'm sure, because we had this remark together, Annegret and myself, we took care as much as we could of a major cooperation program between France and Germany, which does not progress exactly as we had planned to. So it shows that whatever the environment is, it remains extremely difficult to put together industries in order to build a real European defense industry. Still, the idea of having it, or at least to go for it, is improving, which is a very first step, but we are far from the goal. So I think that it's good that the idea of having a European sovereignty is not anymore a bad word, because it was understood as something rude at the very beginning. Now it sticks to a reality that must be managed, but there is an urgency to go faster than we do. So that, in my view, something that must be dealt with. And we also, listening to Enrico Letta in the previous panel, I was thinking about how difficult it had been to create a unique European market. And he criticized rightly the fact that we are trying now to create new borders when the founders tried to eliminate the borders. But we have to take into account the competition rules. And we have to think also not only about how we could build a European defense industry, but how, more broadly, we could build a more powerful European industry, not only in the defense field. And this raises a question of how we deal with the historical competition rules we have, and that are extremely difficult to adjust because it needs the unanimity between the member states. But this is a major question that cannot be put aside.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask Annegret to carry on these thoughts, really, which Florence has started, because I'm sure you have something to add to that. And I guess the question is, you know, at the beginning of this war in Ukraine, Chancellor Scholz talked about this Zeitenwende, a decisive shift. Has it happened? Is it happening? Will it happen? And do you concur with Florence that these are the steps that need to be taken, or is there something else?
So, first of all, when it comes to Germany, this Zeitenwende, time shift, there is now an expression, slow motion turnaround, because I think what we are dealing with in the ongoing political situation in Germany is that we are dealing with this Zeitenwende in kind of peaceful environment. But we are not in a peaceful environment. Russia has rebuilt his economy on conditions of war. And I think what we have to do in Germany, but also in Europe, is to do this, especially when it comes to armaments and to cooperation on the security level. And what we have to say about European sovereignty, I'm very glad that now, and in regard of the Russian war in Ukraine, there is no more a discussion if Europeans could or should do their own thing and put the US on the sideline. It's not possible. I think the most important security for all of us is a good cooperation between US and the Europeans within the framework of NATO and in a good cooperation with the European Union. But as Florence mentioned, the problem is when it comes to cooperate on security level, there is a lot of public support for this idea. But we see, especially in regard with debates in our national parliaments, there is always the question about economy, about employment, and about different national interests. And it makes it so difficult to put these things together. But what we see, especially when it comes to very new systems like FCAS or other things, if we are not able to develop this together in Europe, there will be developed by the US or other countries in the world. And I think we should have the idea and the determination to make this on our own, and therefore there is no alternative as to work together, but it's very complicated. But the Russian war against Ukraine have given us given us a push in the right direction, and I hope this is something sustainable for the future.
Thank you. I guess I'll put the same question to you, Hryhoriy, as a scholar of international relations and somebody on the front line of geopolitics in Ukraine. How do you think the EU can best manage these multiple conflicts? Is there a need for a new security architecture, or does Europe just need to do what it's doing?
There are two parts in the question. First, to accomplish this role, the EU needs first to learn of the mistakes of the past. The two mistakes that has relations to the war in Ukraine and the evolution of the tensions in the region. Probably we could start with Georgia. So over the 20% of Georgian territory was occupied de facto by Russia. At that time, France was at the helm of the European Union. EU presidency, President Sarkozy negotiated a plan that resulted in a frozen conflict, which basically was read or treated by Russia as a green light to try to do something more ambitious. Until recently, the same 20% of Ukraine's territory were occupied by Russia now. Now, as a result of Ukrainian counteroffensive, is 17%, but it's still increase of 7% of Crimea and Donbass before the war to 17%, plus 10%. And we remember when Crimea was annexed illegally and Donbass, the eastern Ukraine, was occupied, for the first time in the history of post-Cold War Germany, after reunification of Germany, Chancellor Merkel, took a decision to lead international efforts to solve the conflict, manage and resolve this conflict. As a result of this, Minsk I, Minsk II appeared, and we know, unfortunately, that they basically resulted in a pause before the major attack. So those are mistakes, lessons to be learned, in addition to the Budapest case, when security guarantees for giving up nuclear arsenal proved to be empty. The major risk now to avoid is to avoid a Buda Minsk, when the worst of Budapest Memorandum of 1994 and the worst of Minsk I and Minsk II will be taken as a platform for the new peace deal for Ukraine. Avoid Buda Minsk by all costs. Then what needs to be done to be forced to solve? I think it is important not to be shy for Europe while we're speaking in the presence of the ministries of defense, but for Europe not to be shy to use its soft power. So this is something that's really, there is no competitors around that could beat Europe on a really strong soft power, however ridiculous it sounds. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, and Moldova, I would like to recognize Moldovan ambassador here, Andrei Popov, it has to do with a decisive move towards Ukraine's and Moldova's integration towards the European Union. This is something that would send clear signal to Putin, that Mr. Putin, so no way for restore the Soviet Empire. This is part of Europe, countries who shared values. And there is one battle, I would like to emphasize it. We haven't won this war yet, but there is one battle that Ukraine has won already. For more than 30 years, since Ukraine's independence, Ukraine was struggling to convince other countries, other leaders, intellectuals in the West, that we're a European country. We're not buffer state, we're not state in between, we're not bridge state, we're part of Europe. So now, after the Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, and most notably after this war, when Ukrainians sacrificed their lives in thousands to show they're part of Europe, I think this battle has already won. And it was a sea change in Germany, but also in France, in terms of considering Ukraine's European future as something that is real, but not as for the empty talk. I think what is important now for Europe, together with Ukraine, to learn the lessons how to equip itself with more muscles. And more muscles means not just arms, because the demand for arms as far as defense industry is concerned. Just one example. Sometimes this war is described as the type of the World War I, trench war, maneuvering war with drones. So do you know how high demand in the drones? Only for this year, we're speaking about more than 200,000 drones that are needed. For the next year, we're speaking about hundreds of thousands of drones that are needed to wage this war only from the Ukrainian side. So if you think further, what the implications of that for the defense industries, because there are different kinds of drones, how to coordinate them, how to use them in various ways, only with the drones part. So that's becoming something that deserves to be a European project in terms of avoiding dependency on China or over-dependency on China on the processors and the others part. So these are the menu action item that I believe is important for not to be shy, to not just to discuss, but to act, including exploring a huge potential that Ukraine has in terms of what is still left, and there are something serious that is left of our military industrial complex, and we are increasing our production, but also experience that our armed forces learned and are learning every day, every night, fighting what is used to be called a second largest and strongest army in the world. Not anymore.
Well, thank you very much. We're really at the end of our time. So unless the Minister wants to add any final thoughts, we're going to finish here. And I'd like to thank all of you very much indeed for a great discussion today and finishing our first day of the conference. Let's all go and have a drink after. Please join me and thank our panelists once again. We need a photograph.